Greetings, curious watchers. Welcome to this episode of Short World Histories with Preston. My name is Tony. I shall be your guide in today's episode as we journey into the country known as Britain, or also known as the United Kingdom. Sit back and relax. Let me take you on a journey. Britain's history is a rich tapestry of events, eras, and empires that have shaped the nation into what it is today. From ancient times to the present, Britain has experienced triumphs, conquests, and transformations that have left a profound impact on its culture, society, and global influence. We shall delve into the significant moments in Britain's history, exploring the various eras and key successes that have defined this remarkable nation. The Paleolithic, Old Stone Age. Britain is the period of the earliest known occupation of Britain by humans. This huge period saw many changes in the environment, encompassing several glacial and interglacial episodes, greatly affecting human settlement in the region. Providing dating for this distant period is difficult and contentious. The inhabitants of the region at this time were bands of hunter-gatherers who roamed northern Europe following herds of animals, or who supported themselves by fishing. Several species of humans have intermittently occupied Great Britain for almost 1 million years. The earliest evidence of human occupation around 900,000 years ago is at Happisburgh on the Norfolk coast, with stone tools and footprints probably made by Homo antecessor. The oldest human fossils, around 500,000 years old, are of Homo heidelbergensis at Boxgrove in Sussex. Until this time, Britain had been permanently connected to the continent by a chalk ridge between southeast England and northern France called the Wheel d'Artois anticline. But during the Anglian glaciation around 425,000 years ago, a megaflood broke through the ridge, and Britain became an island when sea levels rose during the following Hoxnean interglacial. Fossils of very early Neanderthals dating to around 400,000 years ago have been found at Swanscombe in Kent, and of classic Neanderthals about 225,000 years old at Pont Newydd in Wales. Britain was unoccupied by humans between 180,000 and 60,000 years ago, when Neanderthals returned. By 40,000 years ago, they had become extinct and modern humans had reached Britain. But even their occupations were brief and intermittent due to a climate which swung between low temperatures with a tundra habitat and severe ice ages, which made Britain uninhabitable for long periods. The last of these, the Younger Dryas, ended around 11,700 years ago, and since then Britain has been continuously occupied. Recent history of Britain begins with its earliest inhabitants in the last 3,000 years. The Celts, who settled in the region around 500 BCE, known for their art, mythology, and warrior culture, established a network of tribes across the British Isles. Their influence can still be seen in modern British culture, particularly in Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. Having lived in the British Isles for centuries, leaving behind evidence of their culture, language, and traditions that persist even today. The Mesolithic era spanned 9,000 to 4,300 BC. The Younger Dryas was followed by the Holocene, which began around 9,700 BC and continues to the present. There was then limited occupation by Arensbergian hunter-gatherers. But this came to an end when there was a final downturn in temperature, which lasted from around 9,400 to 9,200 BC. Mesolithic people occupied Britain by around 9000 BC, and it has been occupied ever since. By 8000 BC, temperatures were higher than today, and birch woodlands spread rapidly. But there was a cold spell around 6200 BC, which lasted about 150 years. The plains of Doggerland were thought to have finally been submerged around 6500 to 6000 BC. But recent evidence suggests that the bridge may have lasted until between 5800 and 5400 BC, and possibly as late as 3800 BC. The warmer climate changed the Arctic environment to one of pine, birch and alder forest. This less open landscape was less conducive to the large herds of reindeer and wild horse that had previously sustained humans. Those animals were replaced in people's diets by pig and less social animals such as elk, red deer, wild boar and aurochs, wild cattle, which would have required different hunting techniques. Tools changed to incorporate barbs which could snag the flesh of an animal, making it harder for it to escape alive. Tiny microliths were developed for hafting onto harpoons and spears. Woodworking tools such as adzes appear in the archaeological record, although some flint blade types remained like their Paleolithic predecessors. The dog was domesticated because of its benefits during hunting, and the wetland environments created by the warmer weather would have been a rich source of fish and game. Wheat of a variety grown in the Middle East was present on the Isle of Wight at the Boldnor Cliff Mesolithic village dating from about 6000 BC. The Neolithic era spanned from 4300 to 2000 BC. The Neolithic was the period of domestication of plants and animals, but the arrival of a Neolithic package of farming and a sedentary lifestyle is increasingly giving way to a more complex view of the changes and continuities in practices that can be observed from the Mesolithic period onwards. For example, the development of Neolithic monumental architecture, apparently venerating the dead, may represent more comprehensive social and ideological changes involving new interpretations of time, ancestry, community, and identity. In any case, the Neolithic Revolution, as it is called, introduced a more settled way of life and ultimately led to societies becoming divided into differing groups of farmers, artisans, and leaders. Forest clearances were undertaken to provide room for cereal cultivation and animal herds. Native cattle and pigs were reared while sheep and goats were later introduced from the continent, as were the wheats and barleys grown in Britain. However, only a few actual settlement sites are known in Britain, unlike the continent. Cave occupation was common at this time. The construction of the earliest earthwork sites in Britain began during the early Neolithic, c. 4400 BC, 3300 BC in the form of long barrows used for communal burial, and the first causewayed enclosures, sites which have parallels on the continent. The former may be derived from the Longhouse, although no Longhouse villages have been found in Britain. The Bronze Age era spanned around 2200 to 750 BC. This period can be subdivided into an earlier phase, 2300 to 1200 BC, and a later one, 1200, 700 BC. Beaker pottery appears in England around 2475. With the revised Stonehenge chronology, this is after the Sarsen Circle, and trilithons were erected at Stonehenge. Several regions of origin have been postulated for the beaker culture, notably the Iberian Peninsula, the Netherlands, and Central Europe. Beaker techniques brought to Britain the skill of refining metal. At first, the users made items from copper, but from around 2150 BCE, smiths had discovered how to smelt bronze, which is much harder than copper, by mixing copper with a small amount of tin. With this discovery, the Bronze Age arrived in Britain. Over the next 1,000 years, bronze gradually replaced stone as the main material for tool and weapon making. Britain had large, easily accessible reserves of tin in the modern areas of Cornwall and Devon, and thus tin mining began. By around 1600 BC, the southwest of Britain was experiencing a trade boom as British tin was exported across Europe, evidence of ports being found in southern Devon at Bantham and Mountbatten. Copper was mined at the Great Orme in North Wales. The Iron Age era spanned around 750 BC, 43 AD. In around 750 BC, iron working techniques reached Britain from southern Europe. Iron was stronger and more plentiful than bronze, and its introduction marks the beginning of the Iron Age. Iron working revolutionized many aspects of life, most importantly agriculture. Iron-tipped plows could turn soil more quickly and deeply than older wooden or bronze ones once, and iron axes could clear forest land more efficiently for agriculture. There was a landscape of arable, pasture, and managed woodland. There were many enclosed settlements and land ownership was important. It is generally thought that by 500 BC, most people inhabiting the British Isles were speaking Common Brythonic on the limited evidence of place names recorded by Pythias of Massalia and transmitted to us second-hand, largely through Strabo. Certainly, by the Roman period there is substantial place and personal name evidence which suggests that this was so. Tacitus also states in his Agricola that the British language differed little from that of the Gauls. Among these people were skilled craftsmen who had begun producing intricately patterned gold jewellery, in addition to tools and weapons of both bronze and iron. It is disputed whether Iron Age Britons were Celts, with some academics such as John Cullis and Simon James actively opposing the idea of Celtic Britain, since the term was only applied at this time to a tribe in Gaul. However, place names and tribal names from the later part of the period suggest that a Celtic language was spoken. The last centuries before the Roman invasion saw an influx of Celtic-speaking refugees from Gaul, approximately modern-day France and Belgium, known as the Belgae, who were displaced as the Roman Empire expanded around 50 BC. They settled along most of the coastline of southern Britain between about 200 BC and AD 43-3. Although it is hard to estimate what proportion of the population there they formed. A Gaulish tribe known as the Parisi, who had cultural links to the continent, appeared in northeast England. The tribes of southeast England became partially Romanized and were responsible for creating the first settlements, oppida, large enough to be called towns. The Roman conquest of Britain in 43 CE marked the beginning of significant change. The Romans introduced new technologies, roads and urban planning, transforming Britain into a more advanced society. Cities such as Londinium, London, Eboracum, York, and Verulamium, St. Albans, flourished under Roman rule. The construction of Hadrian's Wall symbolized the northern limit of the Roman Empire and showcased their engineering prowess. Roman Britain was the territory that became the Roman province of Britannia after the Roman conquest of Britain, consisting of a large part of the island of Great Britain. The occupation lasted from AD 43 to AD 410. Julius Caesar invaded Britain in 55 and 54 BC as part of his Gallic Wars. According to Caesar, the Britons had been overrun or culturally assimilated by the Belgae during the British Iron Age and had been aiding Caesar's enemies. The Belgae were the only Celtic tribe to cross the sea into Britain, for to all other Celtic tribes this land was unknown. He received tribute, installed the friendly King Mandubratius over the Trinovantes, and returned to Gaul. Planned invasions under Augustus were called off in 34, 27, and 25 BC. In 40 AD, Caligula assembled 200,000 men at the Channel on the continent, only to have them gather seashells, musculi, according to Suetonius, perhaps as a symbolic gesture to proclaim Caligula's victory over the sea. 3 years later, Claudius directed 4 legions to invade Britain and restore the exiled king Verica over the Atrebates. The Romans defeated the Catuvelluni and then organized their conquests as the province of Britain. By 47 AD, the Romans held the land southeast of the Fossoway. Control over Wales was delayed by reverses and the effects of Boudicca's uprising, but the Romans expanded steadily northwards. Following the withdrawal of Roman forces in the early 5th century, Britain faced invasions from various groups, including the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. This period saw the emergence of several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, such as Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria, which laid the foundations for the future nation of England. The proximate cause of the end of Roman rule in Britannia appears to have been a power struggle between aristocrats and Stilicho, a Roman general and strongman of the Roman Empire, in order to protect Italy from invasions by the Visigoths. Stilicho had seriously depleted the Roman forces defending the Limes Germanicus. In the summer of 406 there was a rebellion of legionarii in Britain that resulted in the acclamation of several usurpers in quick succession as imperator, a declaration of rebellion against the ruling emperor. The last of these, Constantine III, crossed the Channel at Bononia and took with him all of the mobile troops left in Britain, thus denuding the province of any first-line military protection. The Roman forces in Gaul, modern France, declared for him, followed by most of those in Hispania, modern Spain. On the 31st of December 406, the Vandals, Burgundians, Alans and Sueves crossed the Rhine and overran the Limes Germanicus. Meanwhile, there were barbarian raids on Britain in 408, but these seem to have been defeated. After 410, Honorius apparently sent letters to the cities of Britain telling them to fend for themselves, though this is sometimes disputed. From the middle of the 5th century, the Germanic raiders began to settle in the eastern river valleys. Later civil wars seem to have broken out, which have been interpreted either as being between pro-Roman and independence groups or between established church and Pelagian parties. A class struggle between peasants and landowners sees Britain violently fragmenting into kingdoms based on British tribal identities. Violently is disputable, but clearly most of the civitates gradually transformed into kingdoms. Life seems to have continued much as before in the countryside, and on a reduced scale in the towns, as evidenced by the descriptions of Germanus's visits. It appears that while Roman cities and towns have decreased in size, they retained administrative and symbolic importance for new polities. The Middle Ages were a time of political turmoil, religious transformation, and cultural development in Britain. Several key events during this era shaped the nation's trajectory. England in the Middle Ages concerns the history of England during the medieval period, from the end of the 5th century through to the start of the early modern period in 1485. When England emerged from the collapse of the Roman Empire, the economy was in tatters and many of the towns abandoned. After several centuries of Germanic immigration, new identities and cultures began to emerge, developing into kingdoms that competed for power. A rich artistic culture flourished under the Anglo-Saxons, producing epic poems such as Beowulf and sophisticated metalwork. The Anglo-Saxons converted to Christianity in the 7th century, and a network of monasteries and convents were built across England. In the 8th and 9th centuries, England faced fierce Viking attacks, and the fighting lasted for many decades. Eventually, Wessex was established as the most powerful kingdom and promoted the growth of an English identity. Despite repeated crises of succession and a Danish seizure of power at the start of the 11th century, it can also be argued that by the 1060s England was a powerful, centralized state with a strong military and successful economy. The Battle of Hastings in 1066 was a pivotal moment in British history. William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, defeated King Harold II, leading to the Norman conquest of England. This event brought about profound changes in governance, architecture, and culture, with the introduction of feudalism and the construction of iconic castles such as the Tower of London. The Norman invasion of England in 1066 led to the defeat and replacement of the Anglo-Saxon elite with Norman and French nobles and their supporters. William the Conqueror and his successors took over the existing statesist system, repressing local revolts and controlling the population through a network of castles. The new rulers introduced a feudal approach to governing England, eradicating the practice of slavery, but creating a much wider body of unfree laborers called serfs. The position of women in society changed as laws regarding land and lordship shifted. England's population more than doubled during the 12th and 13th centuries, fueling an expansion of the towns, cities, and trade, helped by warmer temperatures across northern Europe. A new wave of monasteries and friaries was established, while ecclesiastical reforms led to tensions between successive kings and archbishops. Despite developments in England's governance and legal system, infighting between the Anglo-Norman elite resulted in multiple civil wars and the loss of Normandy. King Richard spent his reign focused on protecting his possessions in France and fighting in the Third Crusade. His brother, John, inherited England in 1199 but lost Normandy and most of Aquitaine after several years of war with France. John fought successive, increasingly expensive, campaigns in a bid to regain these possessions. John's efforts to raise revenues, combined with his fractious relationships with many of the English barons, led to confrontation in 1215, an attempt to restore peace through the signing of Magna Carta, and finally the outbreak of the First Barons' War. In 1215, King John faced rebellion from his barons, resulting in the creation of the Magna Carta. This document, considered a cornerstone of modern democracy, established principles of justice, individual rights, and limitations on royal power. It laid the groundwork for the development of constitutional monarchy and the rule of law in Britain. John died having fought the rebel barons and their French backers to a stalemate, and royal power was re-established by barons loyal to the young Henry III. England's power structures remained unstable, and the outbreak of the Second Barons' War in 1264 resulted in the king's capture by Simon de Montfort. Henry's son, Edward, defeated the rebel factions between 1265 and 1267, restoring his father to power. On becoming king, Edward I rebuilt the status of the monarchy, restoring and extending key castles that had fallen into disrepair. Uprisings by the princes of North Wales led to Edward mobilizing a huge army, defeating the native Welsh and undertaking a program of English colonization and castle building across the region. Further wars were conducted in Flanders and Aquitaine. Edward also fought campaigns in Scotland, but was unable to achieve strategic victory, and the costs created tensions that nearly led to civil war. 51. Edward the Tech inherited the war with Scotland and faced growing opposition to his rule as a result of his royal favourites and military failures. The Despencer War of 1321-22 was followed by instability and the subsequent overthrow and possible murder of Edward in 1327 at the hands of his French wife, Isabella, and a rebel baron, Roger Mortimer. Isabella and Mortimer's regime lasted only a few years before falling to a coup, led by Isabella's son Edward III in 1330. The 14th century in England saw the Great Famine and the Black Death, catastrophic events that killed around half of England's population, throwing the economy into chaos and undermining the old political order. Social unrest followed, resulting in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, while the changes in the economy resulted in the emergence of a new class of gentry, and the nobility began to exercise power through a system termed bastard feudalism. Nearly 1,500 villages were deserted by their inhabitants, and many men and women sought new opportunities in the towns and cities. New technologies were introduced, and England produced some of the great medieval philosophers and natural scientists. English kings in the 14th and 15th centuries laid claim to the French throne, resulting in the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War between England and France was a series of conflicts that lasted over a century. Key battles such as Agincourt showcased the military prowess of the English longbowmen. The war ultimately strengthened national identity and contributed to the decline of feudalism. At times, England enjoyed huge military success, with the economy buoyed by profits from the international wool and cloth trade. But by 1450, the country was in crisis, facing military failure in France and an ongoing recession. More social unrest broke out, followed by the Wars of the Roses, fought between rival factions of the English nobility. Henry VII's victory in 1485 conventionally marks the end of the Middle Ages in England and the start of the early modern period. The 100 Years' War was a significant conflict in the Middle Ages. During the war, 5 generations of kings from 2 rival dynasties fought for the throne of France, which was then the wealthiest and most populous kingdom in Western Europe. The war had a lasting effect on European history. Both sides produced innovations in military technology and tactics, including professional standing armies and artillery, that permanently changed European warfare. Chivalry, which reached its height during the conflict, subsequently declined. Stronger national identities took root in both kingdoms, which became more centralized and gradually emerged as global powers. The Renaissance brought a renewed focus on art, science, and literature, while the Reformation led to significant religious changes in Britain. The English Reformation took place in 16th century England when the king wished to divorce his Spanish wife, who had delivered no male children, and marry Anne Boleyn. The English Church then broke away first from the authority of the Pope and bishops over the king, and then from some doctrines and practices of the Catholic Church. It then became the Church of England rather than a regional division of the Catholic Church. The English Reformation began as more of a political affair than a theological dispute. In 1527, Henry VIII requested an annulment of his marriage, but Pope Clement VII refused. In response, the Reformation Parliament, 1529-1536, passed laws abolishing papal authority in England and declared Henry to be supreme head of the Church of England. Final authority in doctrinal disputes now rested with the monarch. Though a religious traditionalist himself, Henry relied on Protestants to support and implement his religious agenda. The theology and liturgy of the Church of England became markedly Protestant during the reign of Henry's son Edward. Catholicism was briefly restored. The Elizabethan religious settlement reintroduced the Protestant religion, but in a more moderate manner. Nevertheless, disputes over the structure, theology, and worship of the Church of England continued for generations. The English Reformation is generally considered to have concluded during the reign of Elizabeth, but scholars also speak of a long Reformation stretching into the 17th and 18th centuries. This time period includes the violent disputes over religion during the Stuart period, most famously the English Civil War, which resulted in the rule of Puritan Oliver Cromwell. After the Stuart Restoration and the Glorious Revolution, the Church of England remained the established church, but a number of nonconformist churches now existed whose members suffered various civil disabilities until these were removed many years later. These events were part of the wider European Reformation, various religious and political movements that affected both the practice of Christianity in Western and Central Europe and relations between church and state. A substantial but dwindling minority of people from the late 16th to early 19th centuries remained Catholics in England. Their church organization remained illegal until the Roman Catholic Relief Act 1829. The Tudor period saw the reigns of influential monarchs such as Henry VIII and Elizabeth. Henry VIII's break with the Catholic Church and the establishment of the Church of England had a lasting impact on British religious and political life. Elizabeth I's reign marked a golden age of exploration, culture, and military success, including the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. The House of Tudor was an English and Welsh dynasty that held the throne of England from 1485 to 1603. They descended from the Tudors of Penmynyd, a Welsh noble family, and Catherine of Valois. The Tudor monarchs ruled the Kingdom of England and the Lordship of Ireland, later the Kingdom of Ireland, for 118 years with 5 monarchs: Henry VII, Henry VIII, Mary I, and Elizabeth I. The Tudors succeeded the House of Plantagenet as rulers of the Kingdom of England, and were succeeded by the Scottish House of Stuart. The first Tudor monarch, Henry VII, descended through his mother from the House of Beaufort, a legitimised branch of the English Royal House of Lancaster, a cadet house of the Plantagenets. The Tudor family rose to power and started the Tudor period in the wake of the Wars of the Roses, 1455-1487, which left the main House of Lancaster, with which the Tudors were aligned, extinct in the male line. The conflict between the Royalists and Parliamentarians during the English Civil War led to the temporary overthrow of the monarchy and the establishment of a republic under Oliver Cromwell. The restoration of Charles II in 1660 marked the return of the monarchy and the beginning of a new era. The English Civil War was a series of civil wars and political machinations between Royalists and Parliamentarians in the Kingdom of England from 1642 to 1651, part of the wider 1639 to 1653 Wars of the Three Kingdoms. The struggle consisted of the First English Civil War and the Second English Civil War. The Anglo-Scottish War of 1650 to 1652 is sometimes referred to as the Third English Civil War, while the conflicts in the three kingdoms of England, Scotland and Ireland had similarities. Each had their own specific issues and objectives. The First English Civil War was fought primarily over the correct balance of power between Parliament and Charles Eyre. It ended in June 1646 with royalist defeat and the king in custody. However, victory exposed parliamentarian divisions over the nature of the political settlement. The vast majority went to war in 1642 to assert Parliament's right to participate in government, not abolish the monarchy, which meant Charles' refusal to make concessions led to a stalemate. Concern over the political influence of radicals within the new model army, like Oliver Cromwell, led to an alliance between moderate parliamentarians and royalists, supported by the Covenanter Scots. Royalist defeat in the 1648 Second English Civil War resulted in the execution of Charles I in January 1649 and establishment of the Commonwealth of England. In 1650, Charles II was crowned King of Scotland in return for agreeing to create a Presbyterian church in both England and Scotland. The subsequent Anglo-Scottish War ended with parliamentarian victory at Worcester on the 3rd of September 1651. Both Ireland and Scotland were incorporated into the Commonwealth, and the British Isles became a unitary state. This arrangement ultimately proved both unpopular and unviable in the long term, and was dissolved upon the Stuart Restoration in 1660. The Georgian period was characterized by the reigns of the Hanoverian kings and the expansion of the British Empire. The American Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars were key events during this time. The Industrial Revolution, which began in the late 18th century, transformed Britain's economy and society, with innovations such as the steam engine and mechanized textile production. The Georgian Era was a period in British history from 1714 to c. 1837, named after the Hanoverian kings. The definition of the Georgian Era is also often extended to include the relatively short reign of William, which ended with his death in 1837. The subperiod that is the Regency era is defined by the regency of George IV as Prince of Wales during the illness of his father George. The transition to the Victorian era was characterized in religion, social values, and the arts by a shift in tone away from rationalism and toward romanticism. The term Georgian is typically used in the context of social and political history and architecture. The term Augustan literature is often used for Augustan drama, Augustan poetry, and Augustan prose in the period 1700-1740s. The term Augustan refers to the acknowledgement of the influence of Latin literature from the ancient Roman Republic. The term Georgian Era is not applied to the time of the two 20th century British kings of this name. Those periods are simply referred to as Georgian. Queen Victoria's reign marked a period of great change and expansion. The British Empire reached its zenith, with colonies and territories spanning the globe. Advances in science, medicine, and technology, including the invention of the telephone and the development of railways, contributed to Britain's global influence. In the history of the United Kingdom and the British Empire, the Victorian era was the reign of Queen Victoria, from the 20th of June 1837 until her death on the 22nd of January 1901. Slightly different definitions are sometimes used. The era followed the Georgian era and preceded the Edwardian era, and its later half overlaps with the first part of the Belle Epoque era of continental Europe. Various liberalising political reforms took place in the UK, including expanding the electoral franchise. The Great Famine caused mass death in Ireland early in the period. The British Empire had relatively peaceful relations with the other great powers. It participated in various military conflicts, mainly against minor powers. The British Empire expanded during this period and was the predominant power in the world. Victorian society valued a high standard of personal conduct across all sections of society. The emphasis on morality gave impetus to social reform, but also placed restrictions on certain groups' liberty. Prosperity rose during the period, but debilitating undernutrition persisted. Literacy and childhood education became near universal in Great Britain for the first time. While some attempts were made to improve living conditions, slum housing and disease remained a severe problem. The period saw significant scientific and technological development. Britain was advanced in industry and engineering, but somewhat less developed in art and education. Great Britain's population increased rapidly, while Ireland's fell sharply. The 18th and 19th centuries were periods of intellectual flourishing and significant technological advancements in Britain. The Industrial Revolution, sometimes divided into the First Industrial Revolution and Second Industrial Revolution, was a transitional period of the global economy toward more widespread, efficient and stable manufacturing processes, succeeding the Second Agricultural Revolution. Beginning in Great Britain around 1760, the Industrial Revolution had spread to continental Europe and the United States by about 1840. This transition included going from hand production methods to machines, new chemical manufacturing and iron production processes, the increasing use of water power and steam power, the development of machine tools, and the rise of the mechanized factory system. Output greatly increased, and the result was an unprecedented rise in population and the rate of population growth. The textile industry was the first to use modern production methods, and textiles became the dominant industry in terms of employment, value of output, and capital invested. Britain played a crucial role in both World War I and World War II. The resilience and determination of the British people during these conflicts, particularly during the Battle of Britain, were instrumental in the Allied victories. The post-war period saw significant social and economic reforms, including the establishment of the National Health Service and the welfare state. The United Kingdom was a leading Allied power during the First World War of 1914-1918. They fought against the Central Powers, mainly Germany. The armed forces were greatly expanded and reorganized. The war marked the founding of the Royal Air Force. The highly controversial introduction in January 1916 of conscription for the first time in British history followed the raising of one of the largest all-volunteer armies in history, known as Kitchener's Army, of more than 2 million men. The outbreak of war was a socially unifying event. Enthusiasm was widespread in 1914 and was similar to that across Europe. The military history of the United Kingdom in World War II covers the Second World War against the Axis powers, starting on the 3rd of September 1939 with the declaration of war by the United Kingdom and France, followed by the UK's dominions, crown colonies and protectorates on Nazi Germany in response to the invasion of Poland by Germany. There was little, however, the Anglo-French alliance could do or did do to help Poland. The phony war culminated in April 1940 with the German invasion of Denmark and Norway. Winston Churchill became Prime Minister and head of a coalition government in May 1940. The defeat of other European countries followed: Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg and France, alongside the British Expeditionary Force, which led to the Dunkirk evacuation in June 1940. Britain and its empire continued the war against Germany. Churchill engaged industry, scientists and engineers to advise and support the government and the military in the prosecution of the war effort. Germany's planned invasion of the UK was averted by the Royal Air Force denying the Luftwaffe air superiority in the Battle of Britain and by its marked inferiority in naval power. Subsequently, urban areas in Britain suffered heavy bombing during the Blitz in late 1941. The Royal Navy sought to blockade Germany and protect merchant ships in the Battle of the Atlantic. The army counterattacked in the Mediterranean and Middle East, including the North African and East African campaigns, and in the Balkans. In recent decades, Britain has faced numerous challenges and changes. The 1980s in Britain were dominated by the leadership of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who took office in 1979. Thatcher's policies included the privatization of state-owned industries, deregulation of the financial sector, and the implementation of austerity measures to curb inflation. These changes led to significant economic restructuring and had profound impacts on British society, including a rise in unemployment and social unrest. In 1982, Britain was involved in a brief but significant conflict with Argentina over the Falkland Islands. The Falklands War, as it came to be known, saw British forces successfully recapture the islands after Argentine forces had invaded and occupied them. The war was a pivotal moment in Thatcher's premiership, bolstering her popularity and demonstrating Britain's military capabilities on the global stage. One of the most important events of the 1990s was the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. This historic accord brought an end to decades of sectarian violence in Northern Ireland, known as the Troubles. The agreement established a devolved government for Northern Ireland and laid the groundwork for lasting peace and political cooperation between the different communities in the region. The late 1990s also saw a significant political shift with the election of Tony Blair in 1997. Blair's government, branded as New Labour, pursued a centrist approach, blending traditional Labour values with free market principles. This period was marked by significant investments in public services, including education and healthcare, and efforts to modernise the British economy. The early 2000s were dominated by Britain's involvement in the Iraq War. In 2003, Britain joined the United States in the invasion of Iraq, claiming that the Iraqi regime possessed weapons of mass destruction. The war proved to be highly controversial and divisive within Britain, leading to widespread protests and debates about the legitimacy and consequences of the intervention. The latter part of the decade was marked by the global financial crisis of 2008. The economic downturn had severe repercussions for Britain, leading to recession, rising unemployment, and significant government intervention to stabilize the banking sector. The crisis prompted a revaluation of financial regulations and economic policies, setting the stage for years of austerity measures and budget cuts. One of the most defining events of the 2010s was the Brexit referendum in 2016. The British public voted to leave the European Union, a decision that led to profound political and economic changes. The process of negotiating and implementing Brexit was complex and contentious, affecting trade, immigration, and Britain's role on the international stage. The onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 brought unprecedented challenges to Britain, as it did to the rest of the world. The government implemented lockdowns, social distancing measures, and an extensive vaccination campaign to combat the virus. The pandemic had wide-ranging impacts on public health, the economy, and social life, prompting ongoing efforts to recover and adapt to new realities. The history of Britain is a testament to its ability to adapt and thrive through various epochs and events. From ancient times to the present day, Britain's journey has been marked by triumphs, transformations, and resilience. The nation's rich heritage, diverse culture, and global influence are a testament to the enduring legacy of its past. And that brings us to the end of today's episode of Short World Histories with Preston. My name is Tony, and I hope you have enjoyed and learned something about Preston's country and mine too. It has been a pleasure to share it with you, and I look forward to meeting you all again next time. Farewell, my friends.